Good afternoon. You know, I feel kind of special because they gave me the Port Talk slot. So, everybody's ready to get ready. Who's ready for Madagascar? Yeah, that's going to be amazing. And shameless plug, tomorrow I am doing a lecture on Madagascar. And I was just looking at it. So all my Madagascar facts are right here. And my Africa facts are somewhere over there, but we're gonna bring them back. And I am wearing my elephant, so we're just staying in the Africa theme. Who had a good time over the last 3 days? Yeah. Who was struck by the poverty? Yeah. And it's one of those juxtapositions where we're thinking this is really cool. Look at all the animals, and then you look over and see the poverty and I don't know if suffering is the right word, but the hardship that folks have to endure in life, and there is this just rub against that, and I think we do need to hold it in tension. I think that is something that we need to not just focus on the cool. And ignore the poverty, nor focus on the poverty and ignore the cool, but to kind of hold that together. And that's part of what I want to talk about today, because so often we talk about Africa as if Africa's a country and not a continent. And by that I mean it is vast, it is different, it is unique, and we do Africa a disservice to do what I'm doing in this lecture, is making it one lecture. It is so many different things, and I don't know if anyone, I'll ask, but Tim Marshall wrote this book on geography. Has anyone read that? Oh, a couple. Cool. Well, then you can go home now, because a lot of this lecture is pulled from that book. I was really struck by it. And what he does is he looks at different countries, and in this case, a continent, and looks at how geography plays into who they are and what they are. And so I'm going to reference his book a great deal because I was struck by some of his thoughts, but some of them are really looking at it. Africa's big, right? I mean, you guys get the idea that it's big. I mean, it's got this big spot in the map that we have, and yet if you look at its coastline, it's just over 18,000 miles in coastline. Now, sounds like a whole lot of coastline, and yet if you look at Europe has more coastline than Africa does. And it's because Europe has all of these inlets and bays and rough edges. Africa is actually pretty smooth around the edges. So while it's really large, its coastline is smaller than Europe. And it has these beaches. Did anyone go swimming? Yeah, I mean, Africa's got these beautiful beaches. I think Australia with the Great Barrier Reef just has great PR, because if you go here and you look at the coral, it's just as vibrant, just as colorful. When you look at the animals, just as vibrant. And so when you look at Africa and say beaches, it's not what we think about when we think about Africa, and yet it has some of the most beautiful beaches in the world and should be a stronger tourist spot just for that. But then if we look at harbors, those things like we pulled into in Mombasa, Africa doesn't have very many naturally occurring good shipping harbors. So what does that mean? Really, it means that if you want to do commerce and you want to do international trade and you want to do it before the 20th century, you did it through shipping. And so while Africa has these beautiful beaches, it has horrible mercantile kind of harbors where ships can come in. You look at rivers then and say, well, why did Europe prosper. One of the reasons why Europe prospered is it had all these navigable rivers where the Rhine and the Rhone, you could place a ship with contents of lumber or gold or anything, spices, and move them along the rivers throughout Europe. But when you come to Africa, beautiful waterfalls, which means you can't do it with ships. I mean, Victoria Falls, anyone going there? Yeah, a couple of you guys. I mean, one of the most beautiful places in the world, but a ship's not going to get there. And so you have these long, flowing, wonderful rivers that have a beautiful waterfall every 50 miles, and therefore you cannot do trade deep into Africa. So what you have is isolation. And so one of the biggest things I want you to be thinking about is the fact that while Africa is beautiful, it developed in isolation. And as the rest of the world is globalizing, it developed in isolation. It didn't have those trade features that's geographically that others had. So I want to start by talking about geography. I want to look at some of the early kingdoms in Africa, and that's just kind of a high level. What are some of the major ones that came along? Looking then towards Africa in the colonial period, and for that we'll focus a little bit more on where we're going as Viking. Look a bit at Africa today and Africa tomorrow. And someone, well, I'm not even going to say that. Africa's difficult. And so why is Africa so poor? I think many of us were struck by Steve's comment in one of his lectures where he said, as an engineer, I was full of hope as I went in on this project, and I came away shaking my head, and I'm paraphrasing him, but came away shaking my head going, this can't be fixed. And so I want to talk about why is it the way it is, and can it be fixed or not? So going all the way back, I figure, we haven't done this in a while. Let's do 200,000 years in 45 minutes. So if you think about it, where did all of mankind start? And at least anthropologists now argue that somewhere between 200, somewhere between 200 and 300,000 years ago, coming out of this area that we just left, is the beginnings of Homo sapien migration. So if you think about it, Africa had at least 150,000 year head start over the rest of the world. So they should be 150,000 years ahead of us. And Jared Diamond says it's the opposite of what one would expect from the runner first off the block. That while humankind may very well have been evolved or at least dispersed from this area, you look at Africa and say they're last in running this race, not first in running the race. That it developed in isolation, and that while mankind moved into Europe and began to essentially, well, I don't have a map of Europe up, work east-west, that, Britain and France and Europe and Russia and Asia all tended to communicate across an east-west line. They didn't communicate and grow on a north-south line. And that leaves Africa out of that kind of developmental corridor that is taking place. Another one is to look at this Mercator map, and when that map we all had on our wall in school, many of us had on our wall in home, you have this map that shows Africa in the middle, and yet it's slightly larger maybe than the rest of the globe. But that's not true. That map is by definition a lie. And what it did is it took this globe and it cut it into fingers and then it tried to meld those fingers into a flat plane, and what you get is this idea of large on the poles and normal size in the middle. So let's do it again. As you see it, that's what it looks like on our wall, but in real life, that's the size. So Africa is actually much larger than even we think about. That it's 3 times larger than the United States. And yet on that Mercator map, the United States looks like it would cover up most of Africa. But the United States barely covers the Sahara. And when you think about that, I mean, just how vast of a continent it is. If you look at going up the way we're not going to do through the Suez, that if you're forced to go around the continent, it adds 6,000 miles to a trip trying to go from Asia to Europe or Asia to the United States. So not being able to cut through the Suez is a huge financial drain on shipping as well. It's really, really large is what I'm trying to say. So if we see it, it's also set up in kind of a 2/3, 1/3 sort of thing. If you look up here at the top, 1/3 of the continent is the Sahara Desert. And then sub-Sahara Desert is actually 2/3. When we think of Africa, often we just think of desert. And yet it's not. It is one of those places that has one of the largest amounts of water storage or water potential storage of any continent. It has a lot of rainfall, a lot of natural water resources as well. 8,000 BC, we begin to see cultivation. That's a couple thousand years earlier than what we see in the Levant. They do rice and sheep. And they have game. And Jared Diamond makes another point, and it's coming off of what we heard on our safaris, that why is it that we have these African buffalo? Why is it that we have rhinos and giraffes? Why aren't they in zoos, or why aren't they cultivated or domesticated so that we can eat them and raise them just like we do cattle? And yet they resist it. They resist being domesticated. And his comment is, history might have turned out differently if African armies, fed by barnyard giraffe meat and backed by waves of cavalry mounted on huge rhinos, which had swept into Europe to overrun its mutton-fed soldiers mounted on puny horses. And I think that's true. I mean, what would have happened if you could have domesticated all of these animals in Africa? Would it have turned out differently if that buffalo, and many of you probably, and if you haven't, it's a great lecture on the Big Five that Richard did a couple days ago, showing a rhino against a buffalo, pushing heads back and forth and who might win. And I was thinking of this quote when I watched it. What if a guy had been mounted on the back of that rhino? The destructive capability that they would have been able to bear in warfare. But the way it turns out, that there is this area called the Sahel, which is the borderland along the Sahara Desert. And it's kind of a rocky, rough terrain, and it truly isolates and separates everything that comes north, including Europe, from everything that comes south. And so all those cultures, all those peoples growing up in the southern sub-Sahara part of Africa grew up not only in isolation from Europe, but grew up in many ways in isolation from each other. So if you begin to wonder why we said there are thousands, well over 1,000 languages in Africa, and hundreds of different cultures, it's because of this isolation. It's that when these rivers go over those waterfalls, you tend to get a clump of people that don't travel and don't interact with the other cultures. So instead of a few cultures that blended like we had in Europe, you get hundreds of cultures and thousands of languages that develop in isolation. And when you do that, you have war, because you have different cultures, different ideas, and when they collide in conflict. And that's part of just what is Africa. I'm not saying it can't be overcome, but it is a deeply rooted cultural divide among these peoples. We talked about rivers. These are gorgeous waterfalls, just absolutely gorgeous. Looking at Victoria Falls and some of the others, we have 1,800-mile long Zambezi River, and it drops 4,900 feet and has these waterfalls every few miles or every few tens of miles. The rivers don't connect. They go from one place to the sea. They don't interlock and create these trading hubs. They hinder trade, and they foster different languages. You're getting that whole, I know I'm beating it really hard, but I want you to leave here thinking isolation. Just why is it so isolated in Africa? If we want to do it again, here's another shot of just isolation. Who's going to cross this? It is incredibly difficult to get into southern Africa below the Sahara. So if we then look at some of the early kingdoms, this first one is one that I think might be the most critical. It's the Mali kingdom. It's the one that actually does have interaction with Europe, and more notably with the Arab tribes.
The Mali Empire. The Great Mali Empire began in the 1200s by Sundiata Keita, sometimes referred to as Lion King. The Mali Empire was known for being the epicenter of trade, elaborate mosques, Islamic schools, and simply for being a world of luxury and riches. One of the greatest leaders of the empire, Mansa Musa, had so much gold that he passed it out to the poor along his Hajj to Mecca. The Mali Empire was so rich through trade that by the 14th century, it was the source of almost half of the world's gold exports from West Africa. The empire was also home to Sangara Madrasa, one of the greatest centers of learning, and housed the largest library in Africa at the time, with an estimated 700,000 manuscripts.
All right, so with that, what I want to now start to weave in, we've said they're in isolation. This tribe is a little bit of an exception, but what we haven't talked about is their wealth. If you were to think of Africa, how many would say, I truly believe that Africa is the richest country in the world? Continent. See, even I do that. Richest continent. I had like 4 over here. Hard to believe that as continents go, Africa has the most natural resources of any continent. It should, by all rights, be the most wealthy continent in the world. And yet it's the poorest. And it's hard to get our eyes around that, or our minds around that. But if we look at this, the Mali Empire, they had half the world's gold exports at one point. I mean, that's just an amazing amount of gold. He's the wealthiest guy. He's working with other Islamic traders. He becomes Arab or Islamic in his faith. He goes on a pilgrimage to Mecca, and along the way, he hands out gold coins to whoever he meets. He comes back and he develops one of the world's first true centers of learning. And so they have that ability if well led. Let's look at another kingdom.
The Kingdom of Kush. This ancient Nubian empire ruled over a vast territory along the Nile River, in what is modern-day Sudan, starting from around 785 BC. This kingdom was so powerful that it even ruled its famous neighbor to the north, Egypt, as the 25th dynasty, which meant the monarchs of Kush were also the pharaohs of Egypt. The kingdom of Kush thrived for over 1,000 years and was the center of trade for iron and gold. The Kushites also mummified their dead and built their own types of pyramids. In fact, the Kushites' capital of Meroe is home to ruins of over 200 pyramids, far more than Egypt.
Yeah, actually, and I had to throw in, I teach Egyptian history, and I used to teach it in the fall, and then we had what's called J-term at Hartwick College, and I would take students for the month of January to Egypt. So I had to throw in a couple of pictures here of my students having clearly way too much fun. But Egypt influenced Kush, and Kush influenced Egypt. That they were countries next door to each other, both fed by the Nile, and the Kushites really wanted to be Egyptian. That it was whatever Big Brother up there to the north was doing, that's what the Kushites wanted. And so Amun, the head god in Egypt, became the head god in Kush. The Egyptians build these cool pyramids. Well, the Kushites say we can do more. They're not quite as grand, they're not quite as tall, but they have more pyramids than are actually found in Egypt. And so as they look at it, the Egyptians come down. This is on the Nubian or Kushite border. Abu Simbel, it was Ramses III put a stone thingy there. We'll talk about the stone thingies when we go on our UNESCO lecture a bit later. But it's this idea that the Nubians or Kushites, same people, are tied in a way to the Egyptians. But the Egyptians are tied to the Kushites because where is all that beautiful Egyptian gold coming from? It's coming from Kush. That's where all the gold mines are. So when Egypt is the strongest, it's known as the kingdom of the three lands: northern Egypt, southern Egypt, and Kush. So whenever you see the three cobras on a headdress in Egypt, it means that pharaoh was actually ruling all three lands. Oh, another one. This is a team that I led as well. I do love this guy. He is just the coolest of the cool back there. But they even had treasure maps where they would say, where is our gold mine? And this Turin canon not only has a lot of great information in it, but it has a map to where the Kush gold mines are. Here's just a shot of what some of their pyramids look like. Taharka is the guy who is that pharaoh who is written about all around the region because he is a Kush king who becomes the king of all Egypt. While Egypt is in a period of decline, he steps in and tries to bring it forward. Now, why do I bring that up? Is it ties biblically. For those who have read the book of Isaiah, it is a historical and prophetic document, and the Judah is being attacked, and Sennacherib comes in and says, basically, surrender or I'm going to siege your city. And he comes up and he has a curious saying where he says, look, I know you are depending on Egypt, that splintered reed of a staff, which pierces the hand of anyone who leans on it. Such is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who depend on him. And I love that image, which is if you're kind of stumbling, having a third point of contact, a cane, and sometimes you push on it like this. And what he's saying is you, Israel, you, Judah, are relying upon Egypt, but that cane that you're just putting all your weight on, it's splintered. And as soon as you lean on it, it's going to snap and go right through your hand. And this is that period where Kush is actually in charge. And Sennacherib is saying that, this is not the Egypt of old. This is a new Egypt. He goes on, now Sennacherib received a report that Taharka, the king of Kush, was marching out to fight against him. So again, historical document talking about this period. This is his name written in a hieroglyphic. I do teach this stuff, but the key here is a cartouche. Is that kind of bullet casing looking thing, and the king's name is in the middle. You always read in Egyptian, not right to left, not left to right, but just the way they felt like writing it. And you read into the mouth of the people. So if you see a lion, you're reading into his mouth, or a snake reading into his head. So here is Taharka. Here's another one where they said, hey, we don't feel like going from right to left. We're going to go from top to bottom, and you go that way. So Taharka is this king of Kush that plays a role. This is actually where he is buried. All right, let's talk about another kingdom.
The Songhai Empire. This large West African kingdom was formed in the 15th century and encompassed a dozen of modern-day African nations. The capital of this massive empire was the city of Gao, which was located in modern-day Mali. Its greatest leader was King Mohammed Eskia, also known as Eskia the Great, who expanded the reach of the kingdom and established hundreds of Islamic schools in Timbuktu. He also opened his court to scholars and poets from throughout the Muslim world. He advocated for learning and rewarded professors with large pensions.
Okay, so same general area as the first kingdom we talked about. You can see that in that divide between Sahara and Sub-Sahara, where they do have some relationships with Arab traders, it begins to advance and you start to see new changes. Here's the last
kingdom of Axum. During the times of the Roman Empire, another influential empire was thriving in East Africa. The kingdom of Axum was a trading giant whose gold and ivory created a vital link between ancient Europe and the Far East. The kingdom of Axum also developed its own written script known as Giz, one of the first in Africa, and had its own unique architectural style.
Yeah, and Axum is kind of fun because that's in Ethiopia. I've spent some time there as well. And what's interesting is their lore is that the Queen of Sheba comes from Axum. And she comes up to meet with Solomon to get his ideas on his wisdom and also to establish trade. They have a child together, at least by lore. And because the Ark of the Covenant is in danger, it is said that Solomon sent the Ark of the Covenant back to Ethiopia, to Axum, with the Queen of Sheba, where maybe the Ark of the Covenant still sits in a church today. And so that's the kingdom of Axum, and we do have one more, I think.
The kingdom of Zimbabwe. Established around 1220, the Kingdom of Zimbabwe expanded artistic and stone masonry tradition to impressive levels. Elaborate stone buildings were built, and trade with Asia and Arabic partners thrived in this kingdom that was greatly influenced by the Kingdom of Mapungubwe in southern Africa. The city of Great Zimbabwe served as the capital of the kingdom. That is where the ruins of the impeccably built buildings are found today.
All right, so there have been some kingdoms, but if you look at it, the bulk of them were either just on that line between sub-Saharan and Saharan or on the eastern side of Africa. Those were the accessible parts to the rest of the world. And so I want to look then at kind of the colonial period. How does this begin to change? And first, as we look at here, it is the Arabs who are coming in, finding wadis where they can come find water and trade, especially in this area, and bring those traders back. Then we begin to see the Portuguese who come down the west coast of Africa from Portugal, and before Vasco da Gama, at least begin to find various ports and people that they can trade with. Here's a quick account of what they found.
The lands south of the Sahara were an entirely different story. The fabled land of the blacks was finally reached in the mid-15th century, or roughly 50 years prior to Columbus. These early European explorers were fascinated by the dramatic differences they encountered. They often described finding healthy, large, and well-built black peoples. These European explorers were also surprised by how well armed and organized these black peoples were south of the Sahara compared to their northern neighbors. This is what Venetian explorer Cadamosto had to say about the region in the year 1468. It appears to me a very marvelous thing that beyond the river, all men are very black, tall, and big, their bodies well formed, the whole of the country green, full of trees and fertile. While on the other side, the men are brownish, small, lean, ill-nourished, and small in stature. The country sterile and arid. Upon arriving in these new lands, typical patterns of early European exploration ensued. Dennis Diaz explored the Cape Verde Islands and Goree Island, and while doing so, he noticed large boats patrolling the nearby waters at a safe distance. He could tell that these locals were taking extra care not to venture too close to this strange alien vessel. The identities of these African warriors is unknown. However, they were most likely Neo-Minka warriors, armed with bows and poison-tipped arrows, tasked with guarding their Gambia River borders in an effort to protect their commercial interests. Though the strategy or method is unclear, the Portuguese caravel somehow managed to overtake one of the Neo-Minka boats and capture 4 men who were promptly taken back to Portugal.
Yeah, so what they find as they're coming down that western coast of Africa is that what they know of Africa is Saharan Africa along the Mediterranean and then the desert, where people are smaller and weaker and just not as well put together. And all of a sudden they get below Saharan Africa and they find that people are very tall, very muscular, very well organized. And so cultures below have been in isolation and they're beginning to see the outside world come in and they want to resist some of that on occasion. However, we talked about slavery in a couple of different lectures, and that slavery has existed forever around the world. But when we think about Africa, we think about African slavery really being a product of Europe, that it comes out of the Portuguese and later the British who take slaves. And yet that's not entirely accurate. That if you go back a couple hundred years before that, it's the Arabs that actually started the slave trade in Africa. That they came in and they were able to talk to various tribes and work with them and give them resources to capture other Africans and then bring them back to Arabia as slaves. So when Portugal comes and the idea of a slave trade comes up, Africa already had an institutionalized slave trade capability that they were using with the Arabians, and they were more than happy to shift that over to the Europeans. So slavery as a resource started much earlier than colonization. And then it moves into this, and I would argue this is the slide that changes the world. That if you think about Africa and why we are where we are today, it's not just that Africa has all these resources that are untapped or mismanaged. It's not just that they were in isolation and have lots of different languages. It's that Europe came in and said, wow, they have all these resources that are untapped, and we're going to divide it up. And there was actually conferences where different nations kind of argued over where their imperial efforts would be, with France over here on the west, and, well, Dutch early, and then Britain there, Britain ultimately in Egypt and others. So what happens is you have hundreds of different people groups. Well, they don't want hundreds of countries. So they come in and they jam different people groups with different languages and different cultures into one arbitrarily defined country. How do you think that's going to go? I mean, these people don't like each other, and yet now all of a sudden they are in one country. And I would argue that that's what really messed the whole thing up. That you arbitrarily and maybe geographically say, here's a river and here's a river, that's our boundary. Well, that's a Western idea, not an African idea of territory. And so when they create it, they create arbitrary territories where one family sits on one side and the other. They're now split into two countries. And then 10 people who don't like each other are now hemmed in together in another. So how does that work? If you look at Libya, which was in the news just a few years ago. Libya is actually 3 different tribes that Europeans put together. That if you look at Tripolitania, that's really a Greek-Roman area. They traded with the north. So from there, they're looking more towards the Mediterranean and north. And then you have this eastern group that really traded exclusively with Egypt. And then you have nomads down in the lower left. Put them together, they have nothing in common. So as soon as there is no longer a foreign power over them saying you are going to be colonial and they gain their independence, well, are we 3 different nations? And if we're not 3 different nations, who's going to be in control? And that's what we see across all of them, is this idea of there are 3 different groups vying for power of Libya today. And that causes strife. Nowhere more so than the DRC. I mean, the DRC is a failed location, kind of like Haiti in many ways, but it's the 2nd largest country in Africa. So here you have a kind of a failed nation that's the 2nd largest. It has 75 million people. And yet it's also one of the richest countries in the world. Something we would never think about. When I think about DRC, I think about Ebola, and I think about all kinds of other diseases, and I think about genocide. I don't think about, cobalt. And yet, cobalt, copper, diamonds, gold, silver, zinc, coal, and manganese, all really expensive commodities that are all over the country able to be mined. But it has 200 ethnic groups, hundreds of languages. It's weak and divided, and genocide of at least 6 million people, probably twice that number. More than 10% of the population has been killed because the different groups fighting over who's going to be in control and then not sharing any of the wealth of the resources with anybody outside their group. So then another group comes up and takes over and kills a bunch of people. And then they take the money and then they get overthrown. And so you have this idea of internal strife with incredible riches, none of it reaching the population. So Congo is DRC. By the way, Democratic Republic of Congo, not democratic, not a republic. But it is the Congo. All right, so Africa today, what are we really working with? I mentioned that they have some of the strongest water resources in the entire world. It's surprising to many of us, but it's not just the Nile River. They have these huge rivers with amazing rainfalls, and yet they don't have any power. Electricity continues to hamper at the basic level. Having people with basic clean water and electricity is something hard to come by. So they're now beginning to create hydroelectric projects. I mean, go figure. If you make a dam, you control enough water, then you're going to have drinking water. If you then run that water through turbines, you're going to have exportable types of electricity. But where do they get the money for that? Where do you think? China is the answer. All right, this was me back in Egypt. I mentioned that I was in the early days of Gaza. I was working on a water relief program for Gaza. We did take one day off and go play at the pyramids, and that's what you're seeing in the upper right-hand side. But Egypt has this amazing river. They worked with the Russians to create a dam decades ago. It has given them the power that they need, electric power. It's also allowed them for agriculture to add more, which is, if you think about Egypt, just how 95% of the population lives within a few miles of the Nile. that is the only real place you can live until you get up to the delta where it breaks into various tributaries. But Egypt has been able to develop probably better than most countries because it controls its water, it has power, and it has the Suez Canal, and a significant chunk. Up to 8% of the world's oil actually flows through the Suez Canal every single day. And the revenue that they generate is immense for the country. If we look at where the tensions are likely to be, it revolves around that same thing, which is Egypt needs the Nile to be able to survive. If somebody upstream builds a dam and says Egypt no longer gets its water, Egypt will become a dust bowl. And Ethiopia did just that. And it opened just a few months ago in October of 24, where Egypt threatened to go to war with Ethiopia if they, in fact, cut the flow of water. Well, so far we're a few months in, and the flow of water seems to be going on. They have 6 different turbines. Ethiopia has gone from a net importer to a net exporter on power. So they have water and power in Ethiopia, but water wars may over time become like oil wars were in the past. And if we look at oil, there's not Nigerian oil. Nigeria is the largest population in Africa at 177 million. And even though the United States controls and England control most of the oil production, a significant chunk of the oil actually goes to China. And there's the haves and the have-nots. All the oil is down here on the coast in the water or in the southern part of the country, and the northern part of the country, which is Islamic, is saying we're not seeing the revenues off of that oil, that you're generating it and keeping it, all the wealth, down here in the south. And a group called Boko Haram, which we've heard of, Boko Haram, you may not have known who they were or where they were, but that is the group in the north here in Nigeria who is saber rattling, saying, hey, if we don't get our share, there is going to be war. Angola, similar. It was a Portuguese colony, and oil is the main resource that is being developed and argued about. And what I love is one group would say we should be in charge and get the money. Another group would come in and say we should be in charge and get the money. The first group says, you know, I'm feeling socialist. I might even be communist. And all of a sudden, Russia comes down and says, well, you know, we're going to help you out with this internal war you're having and give you supplies. While the other side goes, you know, I don't think I'm communist. And the Americans come down and start giving them money. And then they have peace. And the part that was communist says, I'm not feeling very communist anymore. I'm feeling actually rather Republican. And all of a sudden, or you could say democratic as well, and all the money flows in from America while the other side goes, well, I really am socialist. I was just kidding before. And the Russians give them funding. And so you get this Cold War action that has taken place for decades where one side wants to fight the other, and they create an international drama by appealing to outside sources for support. So while they're rich in resources, they have this ongoing struggle for who is going to be supported by whom and who's going to be in charge, and it's just a cycle that goes round and round again. So what's happening more today, and if we look at it, it's China. That China is using an imperial colonial model different than what the West did in the 15, 16, 1700s. That now they're coming in and they're saying, hey, you want a road? We're going to build you a road, let's just say Mombasa to Nairobi. Anybody on that road yesterday? Yeah, not going so well. But I think it's a $12 billion road that they're putting in, and you can see parts of it are coming in and parts of it are not. They actually put in a railroad along there just a few years ago, and that's actually working. But China wants the oil that's going to be coming out of this area. Let me show you a quick video on this.
Political alliances manifest themselves here, on the voting floor of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, New York. In this room, countries impose legislation that carries weight worldwide, and so what happens in this room is the physical materialization of the world's politics. 47 years ago, exactly that happened when one of the General Assembly's most consequential votes occurred. China, you see, essentially has two governments. There's the Republic of China, which used to control the mainland and Taiwan, but today only administers Taiwan, and there's the People's Republic of China, which controls the mainland. Both claim to be the rightful governments of all of the Chinese territory, both Taiwan and the mainland, and so back in 1971, the United Nations had to decide which government would represent China. Essentially, the question was which government was the rightful leader of the territory, as there could only be one in the United Nations. The US was the main superpower opposing the People's Republic representing China, as it had a strong political and military alliance with the Republic of China government, and so the vote was essentially the US's sphere of influence versus the world. Among the 35 countries that voted against the People's Republic were much of Africa, the Central African Republic, Chad, Gabon, Liberia, Niger, South Africa, and plenty of others that sided with the US. Despite the US's effort, the resolution ended up passing, and the representative government for China in the UN was switched to the People's Republic of China. But what's interesting about this vote is not the result, it's who voted against the People's Republic. Since that 1971 vote, you see, something has changed. In 2007, the UN General Assembly met once again to vote on whether to adopt a resolution condemning the human rights situation in North Korea. As one of North Korea's strongest allies, this vote was China and its sphere of influence versus the world. In this vote, though, only Burundi, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Ghana, Kenya, Lesotho, Liberia, Madagascar, Malawi, Mauritania, and Tanzania voted against China. All the 43 other African countries either abstained or voted no along with China, because in the 40 years between these votes, political ties changed. Africa no longer bows to the US. Much of the continent is now economically and politically aligned with the world's fastest emerging superpower, China. The simple answer for why this is because China has pumped huge amounts of money into the continent of Africa. They're buying allies. For example, China built a $3.2 billion railway in Kenya trekking the 300 miles from Nairobi, the capital, to Mombasa, the second largest city and primary port, in 4 hours and 30 minutes. That's faster than what the fastest train in the US, the Acela Express, takes to travel the equivalent distance from Philadelphia to Boston. China also built a $526 million dam in Guinea, which helped push the country from having constant power shortages to making more energy than it needs and selling the extra capacity to its neighbors. China also built a $475 million light rail system in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the first of its kind in sub-Saharan Africa, designed as a way to combat the capital's crippling traffic. These are only a sampling. There are literally hundreds of others of Chinese infrastructure projects in Africa each year, all across the continent.
Okay, so what they want is China wants the UN votes to be able to back its global interest. They're using infrastructure support to do that. Now, unlike colonialism, it's gone really well. Surprisingly, when they've done surveys, people like China. They don't like their products because their products are cheap and break, but they love the fact that China is investing in them. And so popularity-wise, the U.S. and Britain, for that matter, have fallen a great deal, while China, in the eyes of the people, has come up. And what they're doing is they're saying China needs unskilled labor. They import that from Africa back to China. China needs an outlet of skilled labor, engineers, doctors, and they're bringing those into Africa. So China's benefiting on both sides. They're also getting most favored nations pricing on oil imports and other raw materials like plutonium to come back to China. So if you see, this is another way to do colonialism that, at least from an outside perspective, it's working. And yet, China couldn't care less about human rights. If you want to, give Mariah Carey 2 million or 10 million of your country's money to come in and do a one-day concert for its leader, which happened, they go fine. If you want to mistreat people, that's not what they're worried about. Is the oil still flowing? Are we still getting our minerals? So China's not overlaying like the U.S. does when it says, we want to buy your stuff, but you've got to treat people ethically. So it's a different way to do colonialism. And it's where I'll pick up on my next China lecture in a few days, kind of taking where are we with China and where are we with Africa and what does the future look like. Guys, have a wonderful night. Have a great dinner. Thank you.